Hello, my name's Chris Cook. I'm an editor here at Tortoise. Welcome to this ThinkIn, or titled "How Should We Bail Out the Universities?" If you've not been to one of these events before, the idea of them is basically it's an elaborate outsourcing project by Tortoise. The big idea is that fundamentally journalists know a lot about a limited number of things, for example, typesetting and paper weights, but we don't know a lot about the rest of the world. And what we want to do is bring in people who do understand the world to help us direct our resources and think about what we should be covering. This is part of our How We Live Next series. And what we're trying to do is think about not just the immediate response to the crisis, but also the longer term. Obviously, with this subject, the short term is pretty frightening and interesting, and there's lots of questions involved in it too. The idea of a ThinkIn is that we want to hear your contributions, your thoughts. So we have a loosely enforced rule that you shouldn't ask questions, but it is only loosely enforced. If you'd like to speak, I'm going to direct you to the chat box on the Zoom app. My colleague Merapi, who is going to be in there chatting with you, probably arguing with you more than moderating, but the hope is that that'll be a place where you can, if you're not feeling brave enough to jump onto the camera, you can have a conversation there. Also though, if you go to the participants tab and you look through, there is a little button that says raise hand. If you want to attract my attention to talk, then please press that button. This is a complicated subject, and I have to ask the participants to remember that not everyone knows their SNCs from their HEFCEs, and it's a topic of enormous public interest. So we just have to be mindful to make sure it's comprehensible. That's said with no one in particular in mind, but I could foresee myself falling into the trap of education jargon. This is a real delight for me because I was an education reporter, and basically reliving my 20s means talking about student number controls. So you know, it's a delight to return to my youthful roots. Joining us, we've got some really remarkable people. Across the top of your screen, you have to see Mark Leach from Wonkhe, Mary Kernock-Cook, who is their former chair of UCAS, chief executive of UCAS, I should say, among other things. Joe Johnson, the former higher education minister. Claire Sosienski, who is from the NUS, and Gavin Conlon, who, if you've ever wondered where, hey Claire, sorry, Sosienski Smith, I've abbreviated you. And Gavin Conlon, if you've ever seen a number in the press about higher education, it's probably Gavin's work. He's from London Economics. And I was actually going to start by asking Gavin to just talk to us about where he thinks the sector sort of is at this moment, what he thinks the sort of big picture is, and what the potential next 12 months could look like. So Gavin.
Okay, thanks a million. So I've just been asked to present a little bit of work, and I'll just keep it to a few minutes. And this is the work that we produced for the University and College Union a month ago. And it's basically looking at the impact of the pandemic on student numbers, finances, and institutional sustainability. Because essentially, I'm an economist, and, the results I'm going to present here are absolutely dismal. There's no nice way of looking at it. I mean, honestly, though, I'm just going to sort of, when I talk about the impact on higher education institutions, I'm going to present the rosy picture. Okay, so there's lots of things that aren't included in this, and basically whatever I present, it's going to be a lot worse. So, for instance, we look at just the impact of the pandemic on tuition fee income and teaching grant income. We don't consider, wider income losses from conferences and from accommodation, things like this. We don't consider continuing students. We don't look at some of the high deferral rates that have been sort of suggested by, for instance, people like the Scottish Funding Council, who have asked their institutions to model 50% reductions in continuing students. So we don't do any of that. So we have a really, relatively speaking, a positive picture. So what we did was we looked at, I'll give you a little bit of the baseline, but essentially the baseline is there's about 965,000 first-year enrolments in UK higher education institutions. It's not all of them. There's some more in conservatoires and smaller specialist institutions. About 73% of students are from the UK and about 27% are non-UK. The first point to note is that even though 73% of students are UK, they account for 63% of tuition fee income. Non-UK students, 27% of the population, but they account for 37% of fee income, and that's your first problem. Second issue is there's, with the 965,000 students, that corresponds to income for the sector of about 38 billion pounds in total in the most recent year available, 18-19. So of the 38 billion in total income, about 18 billion is tuition fee income. So half of university income is based off tuition fees. Per institution, that's about 140 million on average, but some institutions generate about 500 million pounds in income. And the issue here that we're going to talk about is essentially the disparity between different types of institutions. You have huge institutions and then you have small specialist institutions. And what we did essentially was we split institutions into 4 groups, sort of ranging, and it wasn't our classification, but essentially the most prestigious, Oxford and Cambridge at the top end, and then 38 institutions that are sort of big Russell Group, well, predominantly Russell Group institutions in cluster 2, and then we move down and we have you know, about 65 cluster 3 institutions, and then cluster 3, cluster 4. Cluster 4 is about 18 smaller more specialist institutions. Now the issue is that depending on the type of institution, in some of these clusters, in clusters 1 and 2, Oxford, Cambridge, and predominantly the Russell Group, about 40% of students are non-UK, so compared to the 27% average. So even a higher reliance on non-UK students. But more than 50% of tuition fee income in place is non-UK origin. In some institutions, 77% of income, tuition fee income, is non-UK. So you can see what's going to happen here. So the last thing I'll just sort of say, for higher education institutions, they employ about 475,000 people. Okay, huge number. That's about 3,800 per institution. Okay, and one thing we also looked at was about net cash inflow and how essentially the commercial viability of institutions. And what we did for the UCU is we essentially looked at the impact of the global recession and the expected domestic recession, which is going to be unimaginable on enrollment rates. And this is going to overall have a negative effect. We predict a small negative effect because we're really conservative. In reality, it's going to be much bigger than what we estimate. Okay, so we sort of suggest there's going to be a 2, 3, 4% reduction in student numbers because of the recession, but it's going to be more than that. Okay, but what we find when we look at the impact of the pandemic, there's a couple of pieces of work out there about the impact of the domestic deferrals. So when we did this piece of work, there was an expectation there was going to be a 14% deferral rate amongst domestic students. Work we published today sort of estimates that's going to be 17%. So we presented, you know, business as usual, what's the likelihood of deferral, and then imagine a COVID-19 impacted environment and experience for students. And essentially, instead of being, you know, 5% deferral rate, was closer to 20%. Okay, so everything works.
So 1 in 5 students won't.
That's what we expect at the moment. That's what we expect at the moment, and it could get worse, it could get better, and this is the issue. So we sort of predict, so there's about 13% of students who are, even if it was business as usual, they would consider deferring. Now, in reality, that sort of trickles away. Some people, you know, firm up their decisions, and it's about 5% when it gets around to, you know, the actual decision. But we predict that on top of whatever the baseline is, another 17% of students, the likelihood is that they won't attend. So all of a sudden, you've got 17% ripped out of the market. Now, so when we did this, we also looked at international students, and there's some British Council data out there, and it basically, you can estimate the likelihood of not attending, and it's in the region of 45–50%. So half of international students may not come. And given what I said earlier about the reliance of different institutions on the international market, this is, you know, devastating. So what do we predict? We predict from the 965,000 baseline students that would normally enroll, let's say, give or take, that's going to drop by about 24%. That's about 230,000 students. That's non-trivial. the impact is going to be bigger in those institutions reliant on international students. It's about 1,900 per institution on average, but it goes way higher. In terms of income, it's about a 2.5 billion loss. Okay, so all of a sudden, 2.5 billion, a minimum estimate, is ripped out of the market. That's income gone. If you sort of like remove some of the conservative assumptions we made, you know, pick a number, it could be 3.5, 4 billion ripped out of annual income. So all of a sudden, that's 20 million per institution. For some institutions, that's 100 million pounds. Okay, so all of a sudden, you know, you've got this big hole to fill. What does 2.5 billion pounds mean? Well, essentially, if you reduce your income or you reduce your expenditure the same as the drop in income, that's the equivalent of 30,000 staff gone out of 474,000. That's a 6% reduction in staff. That's 240 per institution. In some institutions, that's 1,000 people, split between academic, non-academic. In the wider economy, you take 2.5 billion out of the economy or out of higher education institutions, and institutions stop spending, staff stop spending. And the effect through the wider economy is about 6 billion pounds. Okay, so it just gets worse and worse, and that's about 63,000 jobs in the economy. So that's sort of rapid fire. The other issue is that in terms of financial sustainability, you know, of the institutions that we looked at in this study, about 3/4, all of a sudden, because of this, have essentially a net cash inflow from operations, which is like a sort of medium-term sustainability measure, which should be around 8%. All of a sudden, 3/4 of institutions have a measure of less than 5%. And at 5%, you're thinking, oh my goodness, it's that's really unpleasant, because you start getting to the point where if you start having negative cash flow from operations, you know, you actually start thinking about paying the salaries. Where's the money going to come from?
I mean, the institution, and one of the things that was an unbelievably bleak picture. There are, just very briefly, just to sort of recap that. So you think 2.5 billion of direct fee losses,
yeah,
across the sector, heavier losses among the research intensives.
Yep.
They are more reliant on overseas income.
Yep.
And the broader impact will be, that is also a, if you like, a narrow version of the losses, because you're not,
yep,
including rent and conference income.
Yep.
And so the university system is quite well provisioned in terms of cash. Like lots and lots of institutions have quite a lot of cash on hand on their balance sheets. They have quite a lot of the bank accounts. So it's not as bad as I thought it might be, if that's any consolation.
I wouldn't quite agree, to be honest. I mean, I think there are other issues. I mean, it's not, I mean, so the analysis we did is like looking at this sort of salami slicing. You lose 2.5 billion pounds of income, and you sort of say, well, we'll reduce expenditure by 2.5 billion, and we'll reduce that in terms of the 60% that's spent on staff and the 40% that's spent on other things. This is salami slicing. The issue is, though, from a number of institutions, if they fall below a certain threshold, if they have, for instance, a debt obligation, they have 50 million pounds in private placement to build something. The issue is going to be that often there are institutions with negative covenants on the debt. So if they run a deficit, for instance, either any deficit or 2 years out of 3 or whatever it might be, then all of a sudden the lender can ask for the entire debt to be repaid. Okay, so so it's not just salami slicing, there are these cliff edges. Now, it may not be the case that lenders are going to go in there and demand the borrower or the lending back, but this is going to hang over certain institutions. And there are absolutely institutions with 100 million pounds worth of private placements. And if they run a surplus of less than 5 million pounds, the lender has the right to, you know, take that money back.
Right.
And that's the issue. And so the issue is that the sector needs a bailout. I mean, number one. It's not just credit constraints, but credit constraints are going to play a role here. So you got to do both. It's real money and it's an alleviation of credit constraints. Okay. Now, the second issue is there's a huge regional disparity. In London is just a massive economy. So, you know, for the people involved, it's dreadful, but, you know, London can take a hit. But if you have institutions in places like, you know, a good example is, you know, Chelmsford or Canterbury, University of Canterbury, or you know, Brighton or whatever, if you take out an institution that has, you know, they're the biggest employer in the region, and that's going to sort of decimate the entire local economy. Those areas are also being affected by a lack of tourism. So, you know, they're getting hammered from left, right, and center. So, you know, there's an issue. I mean, the other issue is that, and I'll just finish with this, is the stabilization cap is so loose that it's better than nothing, but, you know, it's quite loose. So you might actually see some institutions impacted to a greater extent by the existence of the stabilization cap at 5% compared to the pandemic.
We'll come to that. We'll come to that. That's quite complicated for people who aren't quite involved.
Yeah.
Claire, can I ask about the sort of from the other end of the telescope? Where is the NUS on this?
Yeah, of course you can. So NUS are entirely with our sister union UCU to say that universities must be underwritten by the government. Meanwhile, we're campaigning for, you know, student safety net for students at the moment being really affected. But yeah, we also generally want there to be no fees, no tuition paid no education paid through tuition, through student debts by the student itself at the point of entry. We believe in free at the point of entry education because education is a public good. And if anything, this crisis has shown just how much putting, you know, tuition burden on the individual student is a failed experiment by this government that pushed, or by past governments, but failed experiment by the government that pushed universities to operate as businesses, you know, competing in a market. But the degree we get isn't a product. I can't return, especially not the students right now, they can't return their degree because it's been unsatisfactory. So definitely underwrite the universities, but use this to kind of push forward just how much our universities and our places of higher education are, you know, anchor institutions, things to be really proud of, major employers. So I'm really not interested in like thinking about universities as like private business ventures of the vice chancellors. The university is its staff and students. And if an institution goes under, that's the staff, that's the students, that's both the academic community, all the great research we like put out as a country, and also exactly what you're saying about the anchor institution in that like community, that there's just going to be so much loss of jobs. It'd be an absolute disaster if universities were allowed to just go under.
Right. So I'll come back, Gavin, I'll come back to you. The Mary, can I ask what you ran the admissions system for undergraduates at UCAS, and you're also, but you're a sort of broad-ranging higher education person, a panjandrum. What do you think there's a sort of question here about how you sort of try and bail out. How is it that you should, you know, what is it we should be thinking about safeguarding as we hear Gavin's crisis prognostications and Claire's, you know, feeling that actually what we need to do is safeguard the courses and the students?
Yeah, so I mean, cutting to the chase, if if students don't turn up to university, universities lose a lot of income. And of course, at the top end, you've got universities much more likely to be reliant on higher fee paying international students. And so the worry is that the top end of the Russell Group and the elite universities, when they don't get international students, they're going to panic, lower their grades, and kind of steal students who might have been going to universities lower down the pecking order. And so my feeling about this is that it's a straightforward problem if students don't enroll. So if UK students are worrying maybe about whether they can still afford it, they're worrying about, do I actually want to turn up if it's all going to be online and I don't get the fuller university experience and so on. International students have those worries as well, but they've also got, you know, kind of international travel and all of that kind of thing to think about whether they actually can physically get to the UK. And so my feeling is that we've come at this from the wrong point of view. The vice chancellors, the universities have asked for a bailout, and actually it's students who need, if you like, a bailout. They need to have their confidence built up and restored, so that they do turn up to university, they do enroll this autumn. You know, I can't think why we're not having more of a conversation about, for example, fee rebates for when campuses are not open. That's what the independent schools have had to do. And actually, if you, let's say you gave a 20% fee reduction for every week that campuses were closed and students could only access online learning, and let's just say campus was closed for half of the academic year, that would cost, in tuition fees, that would cost a university less than £1,000 on domestic fees. And that's less than 4% of the total fee that they'd get over 3 years. And it seems to me that those kind of investments to actually keep your students and get their loyalty and confidence, in addition to that, students are in this terrible rent trap of not knowing whether they should commit to rent in halls or in private university accommodation, because they don't know whether they're going to be able to physically go to university. I can't think why we're not having a really serious conversation about how we can negotiate with private providers and private landlords to support and protect students. I think students really need to know clearly about teaching and learning and assessment arrangements, what are going to be made. You know, it's not just stuff bunged online, that actually some universities are doing some great things that make online learning quite engaging. And a clear outline of what a university would look like if it was partially open or COVID safe, I think the current jargon is, you know, what it might look like. I thought it was really eye-catching, the University of Bolton this morning, which came out with a funky little video and a whole list of things that they would put in place to make sure that their students could actually turn up and do their studies, albeit with some differences from normal. But that's the kind of thing we need. You know, students need that confidence, and then I think they won't be worrying this August, September about whether they should be taking that big leap. You know, they need hardship funds clearly signposted. They need to know what other online events will be available. I think they need very clear complaints and concerns channels so that that are manned and are responded to. So that they know that if they're having problems with, you know, this unpredictable situation, that they've got someone they can talk to about it. And last of all, they really need some help, probably actually from the government, to make up for the part-time jobs that they normally would have to help them with living costs and being at university, so that a lot of students will have part-time jobs actually on campus in the coffee bars and the cafes, and you know, they might have local retail jobs and so on. And those are just not going to be there. Certainly not in the same numbers as we would have had before. If we can put those things in place to make students feel confident that they'll get something, and that where it's online, they might get a fee rebate, I don't think we'd be having the same conversation about universities' finances.
Right. I think that sounds quite expensive, Mary. That is my concern.
Is it as expensive as having no students at all? I just don't think it is. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that this wouldn't be a conversation that universities might have with the government to help them with those extra costs. But they've seemed as if they've come to the government for a bailout in a very self-interested way. And actually, if they came to the government and said, look, we think students are really important in this, they might have got a better hearing than they did.
Right. Can I come to Mark now? I'll come to Joe last of all as the representative of policy past. But Mark, what do you think the questions we should be asking at this point are for the sector?
Questions to government or questions to universities?
What is the way that we should think about this as a question? What are the parameters?
I think one of the big unanswered questions right now is whether it will be safe or legal or desirable for the mass migration of students to either return to university or travel there for the first time in September or October. And this seems to be really closely aligned with the trajectory of the pandemic, and obviously, huge unknowns for that right now. But that uncertainty is causing this kind of logjam and chaos for universities trying to plan for what to do. So I think that part of the issue is that we've allowed universities to become largely autonomous institutions. It's people forget they're not just kind of big schools, or when they don't operate like local government, they can kind of do whatever they like. And no one was really prepared for a situation like this pandemic. And we've seen time and time and again, different universities adopt different approaches, and then everyone kind of try and race to catch up with them, because the market is in a very weird place this year, and no one knows what's going to happen. And really no one has a kind of solid answer about the trajectory of the pandemic, as I say. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. Mary talked about Bolton this morning. Hi, Sammy. Sorry, I've got interrupted by bedtime. Sorry, 1 second.
This shows how hard it is to do remote learning.
Yeah. So the question for government is, do we need a nationally coordinated plan to reopen universities? Can a piecemeal approach be possibly satisfactory to students, to worried parents, to anxious returning students, when there's so much at stake, so much individual financial risk at stake, and obviously for universities so much when it comes to the delivery of higher education, which is expensive, as Gavin set out really, really clearly. So I think one of the things that is going to have to change is bringing together some of the response, both on a kind of government and sector level. I'm not optimistic though, because it doesn't seem like there's a lot in the pipeline for that to happen. But pressure by worried parents, pressure by prospective students, pressure by current students, I think will help move those answers along, particularly after we're out of this row about school opening, which is clearly dominating a lot of government's attention when it comes to education policy.
I think one of the things I think is under discussed in the sector is that is literally footprint, is physical space. Yeah. So the Coventry and say Manchester have very similar undergraduate populations, but Manchester is an institution with 3 times the number of buildings and space. Yeah. And trying to in this sort of coming, one of the things I don't think people are talking about enough is the idea we may end up with differentiated positions. The collegiate model, for its many problems, does actually mean that Oxford and Cambridge have ridiculous surpluses of space that mean they can more easily socially distance.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you've probably been there. You've probably visited some of these arcane colleges, and these dark little alleys and little nooks and corners. It's much harder to see how you can create one-way systems around all of that than a modern kind of purpose-built university campus with the kind of capacity designed for a certain amount of students. I think clearly clearly the pain's not felt equally, and Oxford and Cambridge will never be worried about having to recruit students in the same way that other universities might. And I suspect, even with, for example, Cambridge saying that lectures are largely going to be online, so obviously the tutorial system is going to continue if it can, and they expect students to be coming to campus and living in a kind of generally normal way. Health warning on, as I say, the kind of migration issue, student accommodation, the other big one, talked about a lot about in the chat so far this evening. But really big. But they're likely to be able to just from kind of brand reach and power alone, manage to recruit a decent cohort next year. Most universities can't say that, and are much more dependent on kind of year-to-year offers and tapping into different, kind of changing demands in the kind of labour market, but also shifting patterns of young people's behaviour. Oxford and Cambridge is what it is, and that it's likely to stand the test of time. And as you say, they have enough cash. I mean, the teaching business of Oxford and Cambridge, pales in comparison to the publishing businesses they have, for example.
Yeah.
Not to mention many other stuff they have going on.
Yeah, Cambridge is more worried about the exam board than the university at the moment.
As they should be, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yes. Joe, so I mean, I can't ask you to do too much crystal ball gazing, but what do you think the right response is at this point to these concerns? What would you be lobbying the Treasury for right now if you were still in post?
Well, I think my successor's hands haven't been strengthened by some fairly, I think, weak lobbying by UK and the representatives of the sector. I wasn't particularly impressed by the strength of arguments that were put forward to government. They never really articulated why the sector needed a specific bailout package above and beyond the general schemes that the government had created to help businesses of all sizes. So the furlough scheme, the coronavirus, business interruption loan programs, etc. The basic hygiene of any request to government is you explain why existing schemes aren't sufficient for your needs. And that sort of basic preparation and basic articulation of the message wasn't done effectively. Now, I'm not denying, as Gavin said at the start, and as Mary and Mark have added to, that this is an exceptionally difficult time, and there will be a need for significant government support to universities. But I don't think the sector helped itself in the way it presented its case back in April. So I think Gavin Williamson would have struggled, basically, with the material that he was working with to make a compelling case to the Treasury. And I think you've got to think about the difficult political context in which Gavin Williamson and my successors are operating in politically, because higher education and universities aren't flavour of the month right now. They're seen as a sector that's had a good funding settlement over the last 12 or so years or more. And there isn't an endless appetite in DFE for allocating any discretionary cash towards the sort of the voluntary bit of tertiary education at a time when other bits of our education system are also crying out for money. So I think Gavin politically would always have been swimming against the tide in arguing for a particular bailout package for universities. So that's the political context. And I think as and when individual institutions do eventually approach DFE and the Treasury for support, they will find that the conditionality attached to it will be very tough.
Right. And what do you think if you were writing the ask from your UK, what do you think the strongest argument would have been?
Well, I think they needed to articulate exactly, as I said, why the liquidity schemes that the government's made available aren't going to enable them to meet their funding needs for the course of the coming academic year, when they'll have the shortfalls in funding of the size that Gavin described. You've got to explain why you can't simply take on that kind of borrowing, and I'm sure there are good explanations, but they weren't made. So I think that's the sort of information which Gavin needs. But then above and beyond that, clearly you've got to make clear the huge value that the sector delivers in terms of our research capability as a country. Without it, we're obviously not going to get anywhere near to meeting all of the ambitions that Number 10 has for our global Britain vision for our post-Brexit future. If our universities are crumbling financially, there's no way we're going to get to 2.4% of GDP on R&D. There's no way we're going to be able to deliver Dominic Cummings's new ARPA and all the rest of it. So of course, they're absolutely central to the government's vision for Britain's place in the world post-Brexit. And they did that sort of part of the brief pretty effectively, I thought.
Right. I think one of the sort of long-standing problems for Britain like what British policy has been, that we don't have anything other than universities to deliver research. And the part of the sort of DARPA conversation was, I think, about creating a parallel stream to do something more, build a sort of America. I mean, something like 15% of American research is delivered through higher education, as opposed to 25% in the UK. I mean, this isn't a moment to fix that. But do you think this might be a moment when they start putting flesh on the bones of the idea of going around universities a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is going to be a temptation to do a lot of reform in the crisis, and I think that's going to be a very delicate and risky process. If funds are moved too rapidly away from a university system into institutions, that will only compound the instability that the sector's facing. So it wouldn't be top of my list of things to be doing right now, but you can certainly see the temptation to do a lot of difficult reform in a crisis. And that I think is one of the risks I see in the conditionality that the government is talking about as and when institutions do approach the Treasury or DFE for funding. The temptation is to say, if you approach government for funding, okay, right, where are your poor quality and low value courses? Let's scrub those out and let's call you an applied university, as if somehow that's going to work. I mean, I think that's a highly risky strategy. I really can't see that there's going to be an easily defensible basis for the Office for Students to go about doing that.
Can we go to Julian Chowdhury, who's raised his hand? Julian is the VC of Plymouth. Julian.
Hi there, Chris.
Hi.
Deputy Vice Chancellor, not Vice Chancellor, just so I don't get the sack for pretending to be the Vice Chancellor.
What do you make of all of this?
It's a really fascinating discussion, and I'm really pleased that Tortoise have put this on. I've worked at 4 universities in my career. Now I'm at the University of Plymouth. I've worked at big research intensives and post 92s like I am now. I think it's really hard to capture a single message about the whole sector. Universities are here for many things. We have been around for a long time. Clearly, the debate at the moment is about students, and particularly undergraduate students, and what will happen in September. But there's also the research agenda, which is key. A lot of universities, including us, do a huge amount of work in widening participation and developing, giving students from underrepresented backgrounds a chance to get a higher education. We work with about 20 further education colleges to support that. And plus there's the civic university agenda, with all of the supporting the jobs in the region and supporting the local region. And there's such diversity in the sector, because we have the big metropolitan universities, we have the very small independent specialist institutions. So there are different things apply to different universities. And Wonkhe, for example, did a really good job at highlighting those differences. In a debate like this, it's very hard, I think, to pull a single message out that says, should we bail out universities, yes or no? The point is, I think all universities have a role to play, and they do a huge amount of good for their society as well as for the country.
I have to confess, I don't know Plymouth very well. Are you a primarily local serving university?
So we're a university that has, it's post-92 university, has very, very strong roots in the southwest. 58% of our students come from, say, the corridor from Bristol down to the Isles of Scilly. We don't have as many, a high proportion of international students as much as, say, our neighbour Exeter. However, we do touch all the pillars in terms of international students, gender, low participation. We are research active. We have some world-class research. We won a Queen's Award this year for research in microplastics. So we're doing a huge amount across the board. But we are very much rooted in the region, but with national tentacles, if you will, with a lot of transnational education abroad.
And one of the strange things about this sort of moment is that universities that recruit very locally are probably in a better place than places that have, what we would have said a few weeks ago, successfully diversified and got foreign students.
Yes, I think that's right, but there's more to it than that, as I'm sure many people will know. I mean, a lot of universities, since universities have been able to recruit as many students as they wish, I think a lot of universities have borrowed heavily on the back of that to expand and to invest. And the problem now, of course, is that with if student numbers do decrease, as it looks likely they will, the borrowing to income ratio then starts to look a little bit dodgy for some universities. But it will be a shame if a global crisis such as COVID causes instability in the sector, where in the long term, the medium term, and for the greater good, universities do so much that's important.
Right. Could we come to Anne Spackman, who's had her hand up, I confess, for a very long time?
Hello.
You've been saying incendiary things in the comments as well.
I'm not sure if they're incendiary or just honest, but I used to run a charity until very recently, working with young people who were primarily aged between 16 and 18. And I looked at the experiences that many of our students who were primarily from disadvantaged backgrounds had at university. And they had a great ambition often to go to university, but their experiences were often very poor, and the quality of their teaching and the value for money was poor. And I feel that if there is going to be, if there's going to be any kind of a bailout now for the sector, there has to be a recognition that there is a need for some quite radical change in quite a lot of the university sector. I think there needs to be much more emphasis on teaching and less on research, because when we talk about the valuable research, we know that there is so much non-valuable research because it's working out why people use umbrellas in the rain kind of stuff. I mean, it appears on the tabloids, you can see it in stories. It's just simply not the kind of thing that is the same as the stuff that's going on at University College or at Imperial or at Loughborough. And I think one of the universities that provides a really good example of how to evolve in a really modern 21st century way is Queen Mary University of London, which has now got Russell Group status, which serves a very high proportion of students, particularly from Asian backgrounds in London, and knows really how to make sure its students feel comfortable and provide a really high quality and rounded experience for those students. It's very different from the experience that I think a lot of other students are having, even in universities with quite good reputations, when you look at the feedback they give on the teaching, the amount of teaching they get. So it just feels at the moment that although this is going to be very painful, a number of people in the chat have been saying, well, should we see some universities and institutions go to the wall? I think it would be much better if they were able to modernize and change themselves. But I think also that change may mean that some are no longer classic universities, because I think we've had an experiment in that enlargement, which has not worked in some places, and that ought to be recognized.
Right. Do you think, I mean, I can see Mark Leach wincing through your comment. I was going to go to Louis Gershon actually next though, who's raised his hand. Hi, Louis. I think you should be unmuted. No, not yet.
Oh, hi. Hey, Chris. Hi, how you doing? I just want to divulge slightly from that topic, because I put something in the group chat, but I thought I would just put it on record, which is that I'm an undergraduate, and my university is currently in discussion with Scottish and English governments about how teaching is going to commence, whether through smaller lectures or seminars or even virtual lessons. But what I mentioned in the chat was that when it comes to a rarer subject, the practical courses such as theatre studies, engineering, nursing, dentistry, all of these subjects where you have a range of compulsory practical projects, I don't feel universities have responded to this or have a solution to these problems, unless of course they decide to ban these specific subjects or the modules in the subjects. This would consequently obviously mean that students wishing a career in these practical projects feel dejected, that universities aren't providing any path for them. And I really don't understand how the universities can respond to this unless they're playing it by ear. Right. Of course, how are students in these areas to be ensured they're going to get the practical education they deserve when the universities, I've done a few readings today, may not allow deferring because they don't want this as an option for students if backlash happens. But that's just the point I wanted to make. Which I think
you're right. It's definitely at the top of VC's thoughts. There's a I know that UCL are running a pilot at the moment to work out how you get people into laboratories in a socially distanced.
Oh right, I didn't know that. Okay.
And it's like it is definitely a thing, and I've And he said on the record, so I can tell you. So David Bell, who's the Vice Chancellor of Sunderland, was saying to me, very worried about nursing in particular. They're very a nursing specialism. How do you? There's only very limited amount you can do with nursing in particular.
Yeah. Did they say anything about the arts and
Well, so that was one of the things that someone brought up for Sheffield Hallam as well. That they do a lot of group working because it's sort of applied learning is their shtick, which means working in teams. So that's sort of the closest thing I've heard to it. But I think the issue about specialist subjects is definitely on the agenda. Like it really is really high. It's quite high up. Okay,
good to know. Good to know.
Yeah, no, but you're right to raise the issue. Could we come back to actually my colleague Tessa?
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone. Not to drag us back to the question or anything, Chris, but just saying, if we're talking about should we bail out universities, it's kind of becoming clearer to me during the course of this conversation. We're talking about two different things. We're talking about the institutions and their future kind of, whether, this is a mortal blow for some of them, and students. And I think, do we need to decouple the conversation between what is required for students in terms of value for money and what they've lost this year in terms of the combination of strikes and lockdown versus the institutions themselves? And if we decouple those, then what are we really looking at in terms of a bailout? And how, when you've got such a divergence in terms of the institutions, in terms of overseas income versus domestic income versus size versus research bias, how do you come up with a system that works? Sorry, that is a question. I know, I break the rules. Sorry.
I think Gavin has wanted to come back for a while, and that's actually quite a good question for Gavin about what the sort of what the shape of a bailout could look like.
Okay, so I mean, the issue is whether we think there should be a bailout or otherwise. I would imagine most people think there should be a bailout of some description. Okay, and that's fair enough. The issue, sort of Joe Johnson was mentioning, is about how to convince the Treasury. You've got the attack dogs in Treasury who are going to just basically look at the spreadsheet and sort of say, this is all fluff. Just give us the evidence, because we've got 50 other competing demands here. Every other industry in the country is getting smashed left, right, and centre. So why do I put money into higher education or into education at all? And if I'm going to put it into education, should I put it to higher education, or should I fund 16 to 19-year-olds? Because they've been, the funding per head has been decimated for 16 to 19s. So the fundamental issue is the evidence and the lobbying has to be better. And education is the biggest long-term determinant of economic growth that there is, full stop. Okay, so we can build railways and things and whatever, but you're not going to get the same long-term return on investment. The return on investment to an undergrad qualification is 10 or 11% to the individual, 10, 11% to the exchequer. That's 10 times, 15 times current borrowing rates, or 20 times, whatever it is. So better arguments have to be made to Treasury. The other issue is that if you decide to not bail out institutions and you let institutions just pare back, what's going to happen in institutions is they're going to shut down entire departments. They're not going to be salami slicing, they'll just shut down departments. The issue here is that this sort of temporary closure of a department becomes permanent immediately, and you remove the research capacity in universities, and that's permanently gone. So the decisions that are made now are permanent. Those institutions that shut down the humanities departments because they think, well, somebody told me it was a low value degree, whatever, they will never reopen. And we've got to be, if you're not going to bail out, are you going to be happy with that? And this is the issue. So there's no ability for the economy to rebound. But one thing that will happen is you will see this greater consolidation, or not consolidation, but institutions will move towards their specialist areas and become more polytechnic-like. Okay. The only silver lining, I'm going to say this slightly politically, the only silver lining with the most recent election is that there's a lot of Tory MPs in constituencies that have universities. That's traditionally not the case. So there are, 20, 30, 35 Tory MPs in some of these constituencies, and they now have institutions, higher education institutions in their patch. And essentially the political argument becomes a lot stronger. It's much more conceivable to actually lobby across the political divide. And I think a lot of this is going to come down to politics. so there's a two-pronged approach. One is with Treasury and actually giving them some proper meat to feast on. The other thing is actually at the political front, where you've got to, get people on side. And, as I said, there's 30 Tory MPs where that wouldn't have been the case previously.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Claire. Hello.
Hi, yeah, I think there's been some really great stuff raised here about how there's not a silver bullet here, that we shouldn't be approaching this question of should we bail out as if when they're bailed out, when they're underwritten, universities, everything is perfect. And I think there's been really interesting stuff coming both from UCU and the kind of unions within higher education, and especially from like NUS and our members across. We do our student safety net campaign which calls for the reimbursement of some students, the debt cancelled for others, the option to redo, as well as an economic package for those leaving education into this recession and graduate job nightmare. Because then there needs to be something there. We surveyed 10,000 of our members, our students, and 20% of them could not access their online education at all. And that's mainly, as Louis really well pointed out very well, that's mainly the students who are in vocational courses, as well as disabled students. So that's absolutely shameful that they can't access their education. Also, digital poverty comes in here. But yeah, I think that's really important that there's like so much campaigning work going on around the underwriting of universities should be taken as standard. It should already be happening, but there's so much more that we need to be working on.
Okay, I mean I think one of the difficult questions about in a crisis is always about what the balance of sort of forward-lookingness and firefighting is. Can I come to Mark actually next? Because I think I'm sort of interested in what Wonkhe's published a lot of stuff about, options going forwards. If you had, say, £3-4 billion to bail out the sector, and let's assume that's enough for now, how would you distribute it?
Oh yeah, because it's nowhere close to enough, Chris. I mean, that might get you, one cohort maybe, at best. I think that the student bailout does come ahead of the sector bailout. So, without the student loan system, without student loans, there is no product for universities to sell. Universities are, on the one hand, autonomous in kind of what they choose to do and who they choose to recruit. On the other hand, completely dependent on a heavily subsidized government student loan scheme. And it seems to me that the scale of this crisis runs kind of deeper than anything anyone would have imagined, and of course touches the most disadvantaged in the most disproportionate ways, as these things always tend to. So it seems to me that students kind of have the least amount of kind of power, least amount of bargaining chips when it comes to their position in all this. Universities have some, but not as many as they would like. But it seems to me that if students were given the flexibility through the loan system by government to be able to pause, furlough themselves, perhaps move institution if their university wasn't able to provide the right course during a crisis, then that would also then kind of feed up into less uncertainty for universities, because part of the kind of the problem is this kind of scramble to know what to do and what to put on and how to deliver some form of higher education in September or January or whatever it's going to be. But if the loan system was deployed to better to allow that kind of flexibility, like we've done in the rest of the economy, and probably for a fraction of the cost. I mean, 3 or 4 billion. As I say, we're talking about kind of a cohort. We're not talking about a full bailout at that point. But if we were to look at, the national furlough scheme is what, £14 billion a month. So we'd still be talking about something significantly less than that. But it seems to me that and I've talked about this before. We have this obsession in the country about the kind of when it comes to debates about higher education with the supply side, and UUK kind of walks into that trap, and it only is a very small piece of that puzzle when it comes to bailout conversation. Joe is very critical of the UUK bailout proposal, and I think in hindsight, particularly, rightly so, we're talking about university cash flow, which kind of pales in comparison to the kind of the underpinning infrastructure of that, which is the student loan and finance system, which is a major chunk of of our economy. But we sort of jumped the gun talking about next year's cash flow, when actually we should be talking about using that system that we have to kind of take away some of the uncertainty for students and universities.
I think can I come to Joe actually on this? I'm going to make the same offer to Joe, that he can have £4 billion to bail out the sector, but how, where does it go? What do you do with it? If it's up to you. I mean, what's the easiest thing to sell?
Well, I mean, look, what I think you need to be really careful of in setting up a sort of a stabilization fund or a bailout fund is that you've got a defensible basis on which to allocate resources and on which to attempt to do a restructuring of the sector. And I simply don't think that you can do it on the basis of Leo earnings, on the basis of raw dropout data, on the basis of any of the various single data sets looked at in a sort of crude, unbenchmarked basis, on a crude, unbenchmarked basis, which is what I think some people are proposing. And I think it's very frustrating, really, to see that we're back having this debate when I spent several years of my life trying to get the sector to embrace a benchmarked, holistic basis for looking at value for money and quality. And you've been known as the TEF, okay? And the TEF sort of limps on a bit. And, I just genuinely think that it's a better holistic measure of where poor value for money is and where low quality is.
So the TEF, for the uninitiated, the TEF is the Teaching Excellence Framework, which is basically Ofsted for universities.
So, many in the sector embraced the TEF, many didn't embrace the TEF, and many mounted an incredible resistance to it. But my view is that the people who mounted a resistance to it maybe not the ones who end up paying a price for that. The people who are going to pay a price for that is the people whose courses serve disadvantaged communities, but who may well underperform in the unbenchmarked data that may well end up being used for the allocation or not of these bailout funds. So the TEF was there to recognize institutions that do well by disadvantaged groups, judging them by the performance of against their peers relative to their cohort and everything. And what we're going to get, I'm concerned, is something that's going to be very, very crude, which the TEF, for all its flaws, and I'm the first to admit that it was a framework that was imperfect and that needed to evolve and improve over time, but at least it would have mitigated some of these risks.
Right. Thanks ever so much for that. I think it is 7:29, and I'm sorry for the people I wasn't able to get to, notably Phoebe, who I appreciate was timed out. I think there's a lot to take away there. I think I was struck that there's consensus about the potential scale of the crisis. I mean, I think there is no one comfortably, cheerily sitting here thinking we're going to sort of amble through this and this is going to be a sort of an easy way through. It's also striking that Anne's Spackman made the point that she sort of is concerned about teaching quality at lots of institutions, which I think, to be fair, is something that's not that's been front of mind for lots of people, in the government in particular, for quite a while. That's what Joe's much maligned TEF was supposed to sort of try to help with. But the question about whether this is a moment for reorganising the sector, as Claire talks about, and as Anne is sort of referring to, or whether this is a moment for basically consolidating, getting through the next moment, trying to keep things on tap. Gavin's quite right that decisions made in the crisis now are potentially going to be quite hard to reverse. If you get rid of your chemists for the next year, you may not be able to rehire them to teach the year after that. You know, you almost certainly won't be able to. You know, this is as Mark has just written, this is, you know, there's going to be reorganization, but this year is all about getting to safety. I'm intrigued by Joe's idea that we could use the TEF as a means for handing out cash. It was originally attached to how much you could increase your tuition fees year on year. If there's this volume of money that gets attached to them, there'll be some institutions will really kick themselves they didn't take it more seriously. But yeah, I think there's a lot to think about, and I'm really pleased that Julian Chowdhury joined us from Plymouth. I think the thought that the sector is more than the institutions that grab the headlines is really important. I think one of the things that's most amazing when you look at a distribution of institutions is how many tiny ones there are. How many of the Newmans and Leeds Trinities and Bishop Grostests are sort of swimming around, the minnows. And a fifth of all teachers come from those tiny little institutions. I'm really pleased that to reconnect with a lot of people who I've met in my 20s, as I said at the beginning. Thank you ever so much for joining us. We don't really have a sort of cultural form for ending online web discussion, but one we've adopted is basically just waving at the camera so that you feel like it's not impolite to leave the call. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time. There are lots of interesting comments in the chat, which I will be combing through later as well. But we'll be publishing something on this next week. I strongly recommend Wonkhe's coverage, which I'm sure everyone on this call is already across. And I'd like to thank all our invited guests and thank you all for coming. So thanks. Bye-bye.